day one of the evidence in U.S. versus Ho. Vuk Jeremic, will we find you inside? To be continued. Okay, here we are in front of the courtroom. It's been a long morning, and the main witness in U.S. versus Ho has been Vuk Jeremic. Vuk Jeremic, former president of the General Assembly, who, while he was president of the General Assembly, was in discussions with Patrick Ho about interesting business procedures. I've actually spoken to Vuk Jeremic outside the courtroom, and he says that he's being trashed in Serbia by people that are haters. I'll get to the specifics. I'm going to write a story, but here's what I want to say, and we'll turn it around this way in case somebody comes out of the courtroom. Here's what needs to be said. What needs to be said is as follows. The UN has no rules. Vuk Jeremic, as soon as he left being PGA, applied to be a consultant for a Shanghai-based business company. And they were trying to get potash contracts. And they were trying to introduce him to some prominent people in D.C. whose names were redacted in the trial. The judge said, oh, well, if it's not important, let's take it out. I think the press and the public have a right to know. There were meetings in Trump Tower, actually not the one on Fifth Avenue, but on First Avenue. This is a trial that's shockingly illustrative of the corruption of the United Nations. Now, I know that there's some Serbian interest in Mr. Jeremic's testimony, so I'm going to focus on that. Oh, okay. Even though Jeremic himself, he's a very suave individual. He kept talking about Harvard, how he met people in Harvard. He met the UAE foreign minister at Harvard, the Sultan, this, that, and the other thing. It's amazing. The blurring of lines between sustainable development and outright filthy lucre is shocking. They describe, he said that it's about the sustainable developments. What, oil contracts? Bribing Chad? The name of Gadio came up. It turns out, and I'm going to cut this off because I want to do a written story. It turns out that Patrick Ho reached out and said, we desperately need contacts with the president of Chad. Do you know him? And Vuk Jeremic didn't know him. And Vuk Jeremic knew the foreign minister of Chad, possibly the current AU guy, but finally, Gadio was the solution. And so we'll see if Gadio speaks this afternoon. I don't know, because Jeremic, they're going through in great detail with his emails, back and forth, and how he was in Chicago, and how he was giving speeches to CEOs, and how in UNGA week he was just wheeling and dealing. It's not just him. I want to emphasize, having spoken to him, I want to be fair. The UN is a cesspool of deal-making and corruption. There is no cooling off period. In fact, a PGA was putting together business deals while PGA. This is why Antonio Guterres doesn't want to do an audit, because it will show that his friends and colleagues and he himself are corrupt. This is why Antonio Guterres made it so that the last UNGA week, unlike the 10 prior, now that we know what to look for, we're unable to enter. He is presiding, Antonio Guterres, over the most corrupt UN ever, and he hasn't even done an audit. Now, we'll be back in the afternoon. To be continued. Okay, here we are. It's Tuesday, November 27th. We're heading back in for Vuk Jeremic, round 2. It's the UN bribery trial of U.S. versus Patrick Ho. Witness, former president of the General Assembly, Vuk Jeremic. Now, on the way out, we disclosed some, and we've just written 2 stories. Took a while to put them up, and we're going back in a bit late, but I can say as follows. Surprising testimony. Some of the testimony involved Trump Tower, but not the Trump Tower, another Trump Tower. This was a Trump Tower across from the UN, of course, where many meetings were held with China Energy Fund Committee and Vuk Jeremic, also a man named Noel Thompson, a Texas oil man, also at the UN for wrestling. See, the UN is just a carnival of corruption, of people advocating for sport. It doesn't look good. He said, we'll take care of each other, we'll get a commission, we'll make a gentleman's agreement. Mr. Richenthal of the prosecution said, what does that mean? And he let Jeremic say, I don't know. Well, of course it means something not in writing, and he'd already testified that all of his deals were in writing. Now again, as I said on the way out, and maybe I'm being too diplomatic here, I knew Vuk Jeremic when he was PGA. He's more energy than the current SG, but honestly, to me, it doesn't look good. The things that he did doesn't look good. He said, when I spoke to him at the elevator during the lunch break, that he always made sure to cross his I's and cross his T's. If so, something is wrong with the rules. That someone, while PGA, can be putting together a corrupt, UN-accredited NGO with the chief executive of Pemex, Emilio. A lot of these were Harvard connections of Mr. Jeremic. Anyway, our focus, it looks like the prosecution's decided not to do anything with Mr. Jeremic. Our focus is on the UN. It remains reformed in any way. And the main person to blame at this time is Antonio Guterres. He's a man who wouldn't even audit, doesn't even want to know what CEFC did. Corrupt, totally corrupt, and a censor. When inner city press began asking about it and how Guterres himself, his son's business links in Africa, next thing we know, beaten up and thrown in the street. Antonio Guterres is corrupt, the UN is corrupt, and we're going back in. More to follow. Okay, here we are. It's Tuesday, November 27th. This is day 2 of the UN bribery trial, U.S. versus Patrick Ho. And you may have seen that earlier today we did a broadcast about Vuk Jeremic, former president of the General Assembly, and his interesting testimony, basically doing deals while he was PGA. Vuk Jeremic. The problem, of course, is the UN's lack of rules and the lack of any type of reform under Antonio Guterres, that rather than even auditing what this CEFC was doing, has chosen to have the press beaten up and thrown out. Disgusting. But surprisingly, at the end, in the afternoon, first there was a Mr. Riccardi-Zhu, former employee of China Energy Fund Committee. Now, the interesting thing is that Mr. Riccardi-Zhu only learned about China Energy Fund Committee because his father worked at the UN. So the interlacing of this NGO, which offered military equipment to Chad, an arms dealer, was giving money to the UN, $1 million grant. There was testimony today about that DESA grant, the Sustainable Development Grant, that in fact DESA took even after the indictment of Patrick Ho, after the arrest and incarceration of Patrick Ho, the UN still took the money. Antonio Guterres took the money after the indictment. Now, Cheikh Gadio began late in the day. It was 4:35 when Gadio began. And Gadio said he's been the foreign minister of Senegal. He started a political party. He's now a parliamentarian, but he hasn't left the country since November 2017 because he's been under a non-prosecution agreement. He can't leave, but he has to tell the truth. And what he told is that when he went with his $2 million in a box, when the $2 million in a box was unveiled in the mansion of Idris Deby, he was shocked. He was shocked, but he didn't walk away. Why didn't he walk away? Well, he wanted to get paid, but also he thought that Chad was an important country because it had fought ISIS, because it had fought Al-Qaeda, because it had fought Boko Haram. He had it all. It was all intermingled, the personal gain and high-minded. I can respect Gadio more than Antonio Guterres. Gadio was born in Saint Louis, Senegal. Gadio, in a sense, part of his racket is true. With Guterres, almost nothing is true. Did Gadio ever have a journalist beaten up and banned? I don't think so. It took Antonio Guterres to do it. I'd love to see Antonio Guterres on the stand, and I hope to see it in this very courthouse, 500 Pearl Street. Come on down, because there will be a cross-examination, and the lies will fall like leaves from the tree. In any event, tomorrow we'll continue Gadio. The day ended after the jury was removed and after Mr. Gadio tried to stay in the courtroom, actually, and hear the arguments. Maybe not on purpose. Anyway, he was removed from the courtroom and put in the jury room. There followed a discussion of a document, a table of the various visits of Mr. Patrick Ho to the United States. And the defense has stipulated that all the visits took place, but they think that visits that didn't involve a visit to the United Nations or an email relevant to the case should be removed from the table. Now, the table is the table. I bet you the whole table's coming in. But we'd asked the UN when this first came down, how did Patrick Ho get into the building? How many times did he use his pass? It's all electrified. And you know, there's one thing about Cheikh Gadio, which he was inaccurate in his testimony. Sorry, Cheikh Gadio. It's not that we want you to stay in Maryland or with Englab Sang, but he was asked specifically if after he left being foreign minister he engaged in any other activities beyond this for-profit consulting firm. And he mentioned a political party, and he mentioned an institute, but he did not mention that he was the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, envoy on Central African Republic. That's how I met him. That's how I saw him. He was in the briefing room. He was in the briefing room next to the current ambassador of Kuwait, talking about CAR. Little did you know, this is a man that was trading in boxes of cash with Idris Deby. He's managed to characterize it that what he did wrong, what he's charged with, is not walking away when he saw the cash. And he couldn't walk away because he hadn't yet been paid his $400,000. Now, we've heard from Senegal only last night that one thing the prosecution said, the defense, that Gadio pled out, or, NBA'd out, because he wants to be president of Senegal. That's no longer the goal, that he's now supporting Macky Sall. It's hard to run for president when you're out of the country under house arrest. Very difficult. Very difficult. Now, you can see, this is some of the journalists that are covering it, and these were some roving photographers down here hoping to get some action. I had some difficulty. When the UN threw me out, they kept my camera. It's shocking. We won't even get into it. All I can say is this is a UN case, okay? They describe UN bribes, UN entry, Trump World Tower. Shocking. And yet the UN doesn't, of course, Antonio Guterres is so corrupt he wants to cover it up. The journalists, where are they? Well, they're lined up to sell Antonio Guterres. December 5th, we asked in writing, today, Stéphane Dujarric, the spokesman, Alison Smale had said he would answer. We asked very simply, what safeguards are in place? They don't just put you up for sale again to the next Patrick Ping, Che Ping Ho. And you know what? There's no answer because the UN is irrevocably broken and corrupt. Had there been another Secretary General, not necessarily Vuk Jeremic, I have to say, based on today's performance, I don't know. I think the corruption might have gotten more and more sophisticated, but he seems to believe, Vuk Jeremic does, that is, that it's good for sustainable development to cut oil deals with Chad and Uganda and potash deals, that's a major principle of the United Nations. I don't know. In any case, maybe we'll suspend this one for now and start a second one. We can do that. Yes, we can do that. Here, at the courthouse, we can tell you the UN is entirely